Hello everyone and welcome back to another historical knitting video. I'm really excited to share with you what I've been working on this week, and that has been a 1892 bustle pad. If you've been following me this far, then you'll know that I'm actually working on making an entire outfit from 1892 and hopefully hand knitting most of it. And so far I finished a pair of stockings, my combinations, the trimming for my corset, as well as a knit petticoat. And now I've decided that the next piece that I'll work on will be the bustle pad itself. When deciding what my bustle pad was actually going to look like, I did look to a few different places to see exactly how I would choose to make my own. I know that Bernadette Banner, who's a fantastic research for all things historical dressmaking, she made a patented 1903 bustle pad, which is a nice small size, but just the right amount of padding to get that extra volume in the back. It was from 1903 and my outfit is closer to 1890, 1892. So I wanted to see if I could find some examples that were maybe a little bit earlier than the 1903 patented pattern. I did find in the delineator that in the 1898 edition, they have some pretty detailed instructions on how to make your own bustle pad with a nice lace trim. And then what was even closer to the time period that I was looking for was an 1890-1891 fashion catalog, which had a bustle pad in it that I actually really liked the look of. Now, it didn't really have any instructions on how to construct it, so my idea is to kind of take the detailed instructions from the 1898 pattern and the 1903 patent to kind of create the look of the 1890/91 bustle pad itself. Most of this project will actually be sewing. I am definitely not an expert sewer. As you can probably tell from my last video, sewing the yoke was quite an ordeal for me, but I've watched a ton of videos and I've tried to do some practice, so I'm hoping that this time I'll be a little bit better than last time. How I'm going to bring historical knitting into this is I'm actually going to choose a lace trim from the book that I've been working off of, the pattern book, which is The Art of Knitting, and this is an original 1892 copy of The Art of Knitting, and in the front it has just an amazingly beautifully long section of lace trims and lace insertion pattern. So I went through a whole bunch of them and I decided to take this one in particular because I thought it looked quite close to the bustle pad illustrations lace itself. And after reading through the instructions, they look pretty straightforward. So if you guys are interested in making this exact same lace, I'll put the link to the free PDF down below so that you guys can also work off of this exact same pattern. As I'm going through it, I'll write up my own instructions. I'll kind of translate it to like the modern US knitting instructions, and I'll write out a lace chart, and I'll also provide a link for that pattern down below, and I'll provide it for free just so you guys can see what my patterns look like after I write them up. Okay, so I think it's time to get sewing and knitting. Wish me luck! After writing up some notes on the pattern myself, I decided to create a sample of the lace that I was going to use to trim the bustle pad in a quite thick yarn, just to double check that the instructions were correct. So you can see here that that's what I'm doing right now, is I'm testing that lace pattern. And I think that it actually turned out quite well, very close to what the picture looks like. And I think the shadow is actually also really nice to look at too. The sampler lace is far too wide, and that's because I used 1.5 size needles and quite thick yarn. Now it's time to do the real lace, and for that I'm actually using quadruple 0 size needles, which is the smallest needles that I've ever used. So for a size comparison, you can see how small that is in comparison to the size 1.5. And for this, I'm starting exactly the same way, casting on, I believe, 23 stitches before just continuing on in the lace pattern. I had a fun time marveling basically at how tiny these stitches are, and I will say, I wish that I could use wooden needles for this because these metal needles are very slippery and stitches are so tiny, but I'm pretty sure that the moment I took those wooden needles in hand, I would have snapped them in half right away, so metal needles it was. With the quadruple 0 size needles and my alpaca yarn, I'm using the exact same yarn that I made the combinations out of and that I made the corset trimming out of, which is the Knit Picks Alpaca Cloud yarn in the colorway Sophia. It is a bit fuzzier than I think that traditionally lace would have been made out of, but I do really like that halo effect on the lace that I have. It's going to take me quite a few pattern repeats in order to actually create enough lace to trim the bustle pad. So while I continue to work on the lace, I'm actually going to start showing you the progress that I'm making on the bustle pad itself. I decided to create my own pattern for the bustle pad itself, and I decided to use the yoke of my warm petticoat as the basis for the top curve of the bustle pad, just so that it would lay well against my waist. So here you can see that I'm tracing out against the top curve of the yoke of my skirt, as well as just kind of using the size of that skirt as a good eyeball measurement for how long and how wide to make the bustle pad. And here you can see that I just completed my first mock-up of the bustle pad base, and I did make a few more adjustments. I thought that this was slightly too pointy at the bottom, so I made those adjustments and then decided to use that as the base for the full mock-up that I was going to make. After I finished cutting out two identical, or hopefully nearly identical pieces, I decided to sketch out some of the other stitching lines that I would need on the bustle pad. Since this is just a mock-up, I decided to eyeball it as close as possible, and then I thought I could do my final adjustments on the final piece, depending on what I thought of these rough sketches that I had done by hand. And here's the moment of truth for my sewing. This is what all this week's video watching and practice has come down to, and I have to say that this sewing feels so much better than last week's sewing. My curves aren't really all that well done, but at least I am not getting all the snagged thread like I did last time. I'm so proud of these stitches. There's no more tension issues, or at least not quite as bad. And now it's time to practice stuff the bustle pad itself. So here you can see I'm just using some cotton stuffing to try to mimic the stuffing pattern in the example bustle pad. I wasn't entirely sure of how I was going to do this in terms of the stitching order versus stuffing order. I did know that this bottom stuffing pad had to be stuffed before I sewed it down. There was no way that I could figure out how to get the stuffing into the complete bottom part, so I'm doing my best not to stitch over the stuffing and just stitch next to it, and that's why I had a ton of pins in there. And here you can see I decided this time that I was going to stitch those straight lines first for the center compartments and then stuff afterwards. And this ended up working out pretty well. I did use a knitting needle to help distribute it a little bit easier and a little bit better, but I think that the stuffing distribution worked out quite well for this. I ended up sewing the top part down and then pinning the sample ribbon to the top as a way to tie it around my waist, just to test out the mock-up and see if I liked the size of it. Besides the wobbly lines and the fact that I didn't turn this mock-up inside out before stuffing it, I think this actually looks quite good and I'm really happy with it, so I decided to use this exactly as is as the basis for my pattern. I also decided to test how my lace looks against the size of the bustle pad, and I think that the size and width of the lace looks very nice against the size of the bustle pad. And now it's time to do it in earnest. I decided to use the fabric mock-up as the pattern on top of my real fabric that I was going to make the bustle out of. I wish that I had made a paper pattern because it would just hold up better when I was tracing around it, but I ended up making it work. I also wish I would have taken like 30 seconds just to iron or steam that center seam out of the bustle pad, but this was very late at night and I really wanted to get some progress going, so I ended up not doing it, but I might try to steam it later on and see if I can get that seam out. I think my second attempt at sewing around the bottom edge of the bustle pad went much better than my first, and while there are still some wobbly lines, especially around the tightest curves, overall I'm quite happy with how this stitch turned out as well. I was pretty pleased with the tension on both sides, no more snags. This time I turned the bustle pad inside out before stuffing the bottom roll, and I decided to do this very similarly to how I did the mock-up, which is first stuffing it with cotton for the bottom roll, pinning that down tightly, and then stitching that down. For the mock-up, I didn't like how uneven my lines were when I was stitching the second U shape on the bustle pad to hold in the stuffing. So I decided to create this basically paper guide that I cut in half from like a folded over sheet of paper to kind of make it even on the right and the left. And I think it actually helped me a lot. I didn't stitch through the paper, I just used it as a guide, and I think that it made for a really clean shape and really clean lines. I used the same idea as the paper for the guides for the straight lines along each side of the center seam, or the center of my bustle pad, for the other chambers to stuff. And I think that that also helped. I felt like I had nice clean lines. Then it was time to stuff the bustle pad very similarly to how I did the mock-up. I just added a little bit more stuffing, I think, than I did for the mock-up version, just to give it that nice volume that I wanted. Similarly to the mock-up, I pinned the ribbon to the waist area of the bustle pad. I pinned it a little bit lower because I wanted to just make the bustle pad a little bit shorter. I had done a quick test fitting, so I pinned it at just about the width of the ribbon itself, and I decided after sewing it down to trim the bit off the top that was sticking out over the ribbon's edge. While I thought that the stitching actually turned out quite well, I wasn't too pleased with how visible it was, and I think that's just a function of the fact that the ribbon that I used was very satiny, so the stitching was quite visible. But at this point I'm actually done with the bustle, and it was time for me to move back to the lace. In between all the sewing sessions, I had continued to knit more and more repeats of the lace itself, and at this point I was well over 20 repeats in, and I've been measuring it against the bustle all along the way just to see if I have enough. And I really like how the pattern turned out, and once again I'm always fascinated with the shadows that this lace throws. I think it's really beautiful. So you can see here that I'm measuring up the lace against the bustle pad, and it looks like I have enough to trim it right at the bottom roll. And this is unblocked, so I was hoping that once I blocked the lace that I would gain enough length to kind of put those creases in it. So here I'm just using a bit of cardboard that I've cut up and some pins to pin down the lace and pin it in place before blocking it itself. For the bottom border, I wanted to make sure that it would stay nice and straight, and I don't have really any pinning materials, so I just decided to use the other needles that I had in my set of double pointed needles in the quadruple zero size. And for the top edges, I just used the normal pins to pin the tops of those diamonds in place. I decided to steam block this lace once again rather than washing it and then waiting for it to dry, and this was actually really quick, much faster than waiting for it to dry, and I think the results actually came out very well. The lace held its shape quite well and it didn't shrink back too much once I took out the pins. I had a slight disappointment after blocking this lace where I laid it out against the bustle pad where I wanted to pin it in place, and it just hadn't grown enough in length even though it didn't shrink back so much, and I really wanted it where basically the zigzag or diamond edge was facing towards the bottom. So you can see here I'm trying to figure out exactly how much more length I have to add in order to make the lace the exact length that I want. So I created a few more repeats, I did more blocking, I did more steaming, and I think that in the end I finally ended up with enough lace to fully trim the bustle pad. I then pinned that lace in place on the bustle pad, and then I hand sewed it to the pad itself through the top edge, just making sure not to go all the way through the pad, just kind of hitting that top layer of fabric. And here you can see sewn in place, the bottom is completely flexible and movable. I also decided to stitch down the top edge just so that it wouldn't curl back and it would stay laying nice and flat. And there you have it, in early 1890s bustle pad. I had a lot of fun with this project. It's the first time that I think I'm remotely proud of my sewing, and I really like how the lace turned out. So thank you everyone so much for watching again this week. If you enjoyed this video, feel free to give it a thumbs up. If you would like to see more content like this, you can go ahead and subscribe. The next project I'll be working on is another petticoat to go on top of my bustle pad, and I hope to see you all again really soon.